Begin the current Daf, Mesechta Gitin Daf Ayin Aleph. We begin on the top line of the Yomid, where the Gemara continues the discussion that relate back to the halacha of our Mishnah, which again, the theme of our Mishnayos are discussing regarding the halachas of shlichus, of appointing someone to be a shliach, and regarding the ability of someone or inability to go ahead and make a shliach, becomes mute, becomes mentally deranged. And that's our Gemara will introduce a teaching that relates back to that halacha of our Mishnah. Today's daf. Some discussing today's daf are regarding a cheresh, that he could speak from a writing, not with his mouth, that you write and you give a get to his wife. Now, the distinction between a cheresh she'einu medaber ve'einu shomea, who that type of person is included in the category of a cheresh v'katan, he's considered that he doesn't have das. But then there's a cheresh hamadaber ve'einu shomea. That in general terminology, sometimes we mean cheresh means he's deaf but not necessarily mute. And then there's the ilim, who's someone that he hears but he doesn't speak. They're kapikchen l'chol devrim. They're considered like totally sane. The one that's considered without das is someone that's in a shemea ve'einu medaber. That's the cheresh. That's like a shaita and a cotton. And Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg makes a distinction of b'medvar marum b'cheresh me'ikarai. He makes a difference between if someone was always deaf mute. But if he was pikech v'nischarish, then actually hukaisa v'henchaisman, then actually then he is allowed to write and other sign because he still has the knowledge of writing from when he was a pikech before he became a cherish. And the machlek is regarding milah b'msum l'shliach. We had on previous stuff regarding that words cannot be given over to a shliach, and do we differentiate between oima amrui when he tells you to say to someone else, would then you be allowed to do a shlichus on mili or not? So begin the current Daf Ayin Aleph, from the top line of the Amid. Says the Gemara Amar of Kahana Amar Rav. He says, Cheresh, a deaf mute, which, when he got married, he was totally competent. And his marriage was a regular marriage. The Mishnah Yevamis of Kavod Beis and Beis teaches us that if the husband becomes a Cheresh or becomes mentally deranged, he's never allowed to divorce her ever. Why? Because there is no power in the gerish of his being a Cheresh, which, again, he doesn't have any das, and he's married now. He doesn't have the power to remove the kedushin he did when he was a chacham. So on that's what Rav is telling us. But if he could speak from his writing, meaning he knows how to write on a piece of parchment, write and give this get to my wife, you and you, such people, and he gives it over to them, that means he is a totally competent person, and so you're going to write and give a get to his wife. So although, like we're saying, that if he becomes a cheresh or a shaita, he cannot divorce her, that's because he doesn't have the das. But if he could write, then he does have the das, and you could divorce his wife. So that Rabbi Yosef says, "My kamash malon, what's Rav teaching us? Tanina, this is our Mishnah. Where's this our Mishnah? Our Mishnah said nishtatik. Someone becomes mute, silenced. They say to him, "Oh, nichtav get leishtacha. Shall we write a get for your wife?" He shakes his head. So we said, we check him out 3 times to know. For a no, he says no. For a yes, he says yes. Okay, we know he has das. So we write him and give it. So you see that even though a person can't talk, even so, if he could write it or shake his head, we see that it's valid. So what's Rav teaching us that we don't know in the halacha of the Mishnah? So, and that's Amalei Rabbi Zera says to him, Ilim Kamrit, you're talking about someone that becomes mute, the halacha of our Mishnah? That wouldn't bring a riot to Rav's case. Shani Ilim, someone becomes mute is different because since he could hear, so he's totally pekech l'chol dvarav. But a cheresh who doesn't hear and doesn't speak, if not for the fact that Rav's chiddush, that he could speak from his writing and allude to what he wants, he would not be able to divorce her. And if not for Rav, I would never have known this. Because the Tanya learned in the Brisa that if you have a cheresh that is medaber ve'einu shomea, that he speaks but he doesn't hear, so zeu cheresh. So as Rashi points out, that's not the cheresh that Chacham always speak about in all places that he's compared to a shaita, because this person is totally like a pekech, like a totally mentally competent person, as the Brisa explicitly telling us. But the cheresh of Rav Kahana, he doesn't hear and doesn't speak. Here we're talking about the Brisa saying he speaks but he doesn't hear. Then Shemei ve'einu medaber, someone who hears and doesn't speak, zeu ilim. That's someone who's mute. They're considered totally competent for all the halachas. So Don't bring me a raya from our Mishnah, which when someone becomes mute, of course there he could shake his head because he has das. Rav was told about a real full-fledged cheresh. That's a big chiddush in Rav that's saying, but however, if he could speak from writing, that means to say that he's still competent enough to divorce his wife. Now, parenthetically, the Gemara says, how do you know that the terminology we use for cheresh refers to someone who speaks but doesn't hear? And how do I know Shemei ben Medaber zer Elam, someone who hears but doesn't speak, that refers to Elam? Because the pasuk in Tilim, pasuk says Banicha cheresh loy eshma. So you see that a cheresh is someone who doesn't hear. Uke Elam lo yiftach piv, can't open up his mouth. You see that refers to someone who's mute. So therefore, that's one approach. Another approach you could say is Kedamar Inchi, like people say ishtakal milule. His words were taken. So like Rashi is the nutrikan. The acronym of Elam is ishtakel milule, a little bit of a extension over there, but therefore that's why Elam is someone who cannot speak. Now, so therefore that's not a difficulty that you're going to ask on Rav's teaching, on Rav's Kahana's teaching, saying, what's your chiddush? It says in the Mishnah. No, it's a big chiddush because our Mishnah is only talking about an Elam and he's talking about a full-fledged cheresh. But on that, Rabbi Zeri says, okay, right, that's not a question. But if I would have a difficulty on this teaching of Kahana, I'll tell you what's difficult to me. Because the time you learn the Brisa. The Brisa quotes a pasuk in Vayikra that says if a soul's going to sin and he's going to hear the voice of a oath, and he's a witness, or he saw something, or he knows something, and Im lo yagadiv, he's not going to tell this testimony that he knows, so he's going to carry a sin because you're supposed to testify when you're supposed to, and you swore that you don't have testimony, you're going to be liable. But says the Brisa, it's saying Im lo yagadiv, he's not going to say. That's pradli ilam. That excludes a person that's mute, that he's not going to be liable for a carbon shvua, for swearing that he doesn't know testimony. If they make him swear and he shakes his head, oh, I don't know, and then they end up finding out that he knows, he's not going to be chayiv. Why? Because in Yochel he cannot tell because he's mute. So even if he really knows the testimony, he's not going to be liable for a carbon for swearing falsely on that. Says the Gemara, ask Reb Zera, according to Rav Kahana Marav, why is he going to be exempt? What do you mean? He could say testimony from the writing. If you held the Rav Kahana's halacha that you're saying that the writing of a mute person is like his speech, then he should be liable, according to this chiddush of Rav. Somebody Abaye says, no, this is not difficult. Why? I mean, Taisus does. Yeah, that's Taisus' question. He's saying that by get is differently because of the Rav Kahana. Yeah, so that's really Taisus' question. So Omale Abaye says, Eidus Karmit? You're talking about testimony? Shani Eidus testimony is different. The Rachman Amad, the Torah says, Mi pihem. It's a pishnaim edim yakum davar, which the word over there is used as pi. It has to be from their mouths, but let me pick some and not from their writings to testify in court. So yeah, you can't compare it to a document that was signed that day where that is normal. So therefore, yeah, Im lo yagid is excluding a ilim, and according to Rab, you could write stuff down. Yeah, but that still wouldn't be a liability for the halacha of not saying testimony, because testimony is not accepted through writing, because it says mi pihem, which is mi al pishnem edim yakum davar. So therefore, that's why he wouldn't be liable even with the chiddush of Rav. But then the Gemara actually says meisvei. The Gemara asks on Abaya. Abaya gave this answer of, oh, Eidus is different, and therefore, even if you're going to consider a cheresh that could speak from writing, it won't be considered a violation of a pishnaim of Im lo yagid. But the Gemara asks from this case of when a person becomes mute and he shakes his head. So the Brisa says like this: Kishem shabayit k'noisel Gitin, just like we check him out regarding the halacha of Gitin, as we said in the halacha of the Mishnah. So because we have him shake his head, right, left, whatever this and that, to know what he's saying. So kach bayit k'noisel l'masayos l'matana. So too, we go ahead and we inspect him when it comes to business dealings, if he wants to sell from his assets, v'la idias, and for testimonies, v'la yerushais, and for inheritance, which we're all going to explain these cases. But kedani mias, one thing says the Gemara, is that you see, is that idias. One of the cases is that the mute person, that's the case of the Mishnah that was nishtatik, that we're coming to explain over here, that he's going to testify his testimony. Wait a second, what idiot? It says mipihem. Obviously, he's doing it from the writing. After he's checked out, we know that he's sane. But you said mipihem, and this guy was mute and he can't speak. So obviously, you see not like Abaye. You see that's not true. Mipihem, that would not exclude the writing of a mute person. So Rabbi Yisrael Amar Rav Sheshe says no. Here we're talking about specifically be'edus isha. We're talking about testifying for a woman to allow her to get remarried. The Kilu Barabban, the rabbis were lenient, as we know that one witness is believed to say her husband died, even a relative or a maidservant, as the Gemara says, Chav Beis. So therefore, that's why we were lenient regarding this person also. But in general, for testimony, to be chayiv for the shvuas eidas of im lo yagid, no, it's not true. Even Rav would agree that you wouldn't be liable for the case of the mute person. But the Gemara says, but it says in the Brisa, inheritances. Now, the Gemara assumes that it means to say to testify the inheritance regarding the inheritance of a regular person. Well, how is he testifying? So Rabbi he says, no, what does it mean Yerushas? It means Yerushas b'noi habachar. It means to say, the firstborn of this mute person. For example, let's say he wanted to equate his firstborn son like one of the other sons. And that's what the father wants to do. So there's no testimony over here. He just wants to make his son, that's the firstborn, equal to the rest. And that's why we check him out to see, is he totally sane or not? We have him shake his head up and down, left and right. And that's why we're picking Yerushas b'nei B'chor, because if he's not coming to change the laws of Yerusha, of the Torah, so why would we need his words at all to check him out? Yerusha happens by itself. So the Gemara explains, if he wants to change around the Yerusha of, let's say, his firstborn son and make it to the rest, so for that we have to check his das, like to know if he knows what he's talking about. But regarding Eidus, no, you're right. He cannot do Eidus with his writing. But the Gemara says, but one of the cases was L'masais L'matanis, was for business dealings. My lav la'alma, isn't that for other people's business? In other words, like Rashi says, to testify, for someone else to say, yeah, I was there and I saw that this was the contract or whatever, this and that. It's again back to the same question. The Gemara says, Lloyd, the day. When it comes to his own business dealing, we want to make sure that he knows what a no is and a yes is. And again, we have not refuted this interpretation of Abaye, who answered for Rav Kahana Rav, that said, don't ask from him from the halacha of him lo yagid. What do you mean? Why can't he be yagid? She should be chayiv, this mute person, because he could write it. No, because by testimony you can't write. You have to actually say it. The Gemara goes now back to Mesavit to ask on Rav, which again, this is the first line of our Amid. The Brisa says, Cheresh, regarding a deaf mute person, you don't go after his gestures and after his contortions of his mouth, and like his lips, is using his lips, or after, and this is the main question, after his handwriting, to consider him as a totally competent person. Only by movable items, that's rabbinic, so that he could go ahead and purchase and sell stuff. Gitin, but not for Gitin, where his marriage was a full-fledged marriage. So that refutes clearly Rav Kahana, who he said that a cheresh, you go after Ksav Yadai. So the Gemara says, you're right, but Tanoihi, it's a machlokes Tanoim. You're right, this brisa was not like Rav Kahana Rav, but I'll show you the next brisa that says like Rav Kahana Rav. The Tanakh learned the brisa from Shimon Lil. It says, Bamed, when do we say this, that we don't go after the Ksav Yadai? I mean, this is like he's going on this previous statement of that we just quoted from this brisa. When do we say we don't go after getting after Ksav Yadai? That's Becheresh Meikaris. It makes an interesting distinction. He says, if this guy was always deaf mute, where he never had, which interesting words of Rashi, a Ksav Yad of Das, meaning his writing never had intelligence, because he never had clear intelligence in his life. He was born like this. Later on, the Gemara is going to ask, but since he was always deaf mute, so then that means that he got married also with just gestures. That means his kedushin was never a biblical kedushin, so therefore he should be allowed to get divorced that way too. But the Gemara is actually going to explain, we're talking about a yavam. A yavam, if the brother-in-law was a cheresh, that means the marriage which he's inheriting was a biblical marriage, which is going over to him, and he, with his own rabbinic divorce of just gestures, cannot revoke the biblical marriage. But But Rabbi Shloimy is making the following distinction. He says, when did we say this halacha that he cannot divorce with his handwriting is if he's always a cheresh, a pikeach. But if he was at one point intelligent, and he learned how to write from clear intelligence, then v'nischarish, if he becomes a deaf mute, then actually such a husband who kaisav, he could write a get, Behain and the others could be chaysim, and they could sign, which is like Rav Kahana, that although now he's mute and he cannot talk, his writing will prove his intelligence, that he still has somewhat, even though he's a cheresh, and then he could divorce like that. So you see, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is like that of Kahana Amarav. So the Gemara continues and asks and says, wait a second. The cheresh me'ikaroloi, is that really so? That if you have someone that was always a deaf mute, he cannot divorce with handwriting? But there's a Mishnah Masechta Yavamas that if you have a cheresh that married a woman, if he wants to, he could divorce her. Why? Because kashem shekainsa b'remiza, because just like he married her with alluding with gestures, kach mitzir b'remiza, he could also divorce her with gestures. So if you're saying he was always a cheresh meikadai, to the contrary, why would you say then it wouldn't work? You're right, he doesn't have a ksiv of das, but that means say his kedusha was also not with das. So it was rabbinic marriage in the first place anyway, so he should be allowed to do that for his divorce. So the Gemara says, you're right. Iba Ishtay, if it was regarding his wife, Hachanami, you're right. Of course he would be able to. Hachameskim, what are we talking about? B'yavimtoi, with his Yavama, his sister-in-law. Her kedushin with his brother was full-fledged. Now, that means it makes it a biblical zika. Now, he cannot do chalitza because he doesn't have the qualification of va'amad va'amar lechafatz lekachta. The Torah says that the Yavam's got to get up and say, I don't want to take her. So he can't say that because he's mute. So he has to marry her. Problem is, now he can never divorce her because his get is only rabbinic because he doesn't know how to have das to say to divorce her. So that cannot remove the biblical zika, and therefore that's what Reb Shimon was saying, that B'cheresh Meikarai, he's not going to be able to get out of this marriage. The Gemara says, wait a second, Yivim Timimad, this sister-in-law from his brother, who was his brother? What does that mean? So the Gemara says, Elam, if you think to say, that the naflo me'achiv cheresh, that it's falling from his brother that was also deaf mute, well then you have the same question. Just like the marriage of his brother was with Remiza, so too the brother-in-law, the brother should also be allowed to do it and divorce her with Remiza. So that says the Gemara, Ella, no, we're talking about the naflo me'achiv pikech. We're talking about where the brother that married this woman who died without any children was a totally competent person, therefore it's a biblical marriage, and therefore he cannot divorce her because this brother-in-law, he's a cheresh, mi'ikarai, and he never had das, even to divorce with the writing, which would be allowed according to Rav Kahana Omarav. That's one approach. Or if you want, you could say, that no, actually I could tell you that his brother who had married this woman was also cheresh. So wait a second, so why wouldn't you be allowed to divorce with Remiza? Because if we let you do as a yavam to your brother that was a cheresh, you might come to allow it with the brother that was a pikech. And since like it doesn't work over there, we're concerned to confuse them, so we don't allow it even if the brother is a cheresh. The Gemara says, if that's the case, ishtinami, then even the wife of a cheresh who was always a cheresh, you should make a gzeira, say no. Even though he got married with Remiza, he's not divorced with Remiza. Because if we let you by the wife, we might let you by the yavama, who there it's a full-fledged kedushin, which it doesn't help gerushin with Remiza, and therefore you shouldn't let with the wife either. So the Gemara says, no, yivimti be yivimti mechalfa. When his brother was a bikeach, we're not gonna let you by the cheresh because he might let you by the bikeach. But ishli be yivimti lemechalfa. We don't get confused with the guy's own wife with his brother's wife. And when it comes to his brother's wife, if he let you do it when his brother was a cheresh, he might let you with the brother that was a bikeach, because they're both sister-in-laws. But by his own wife, well, that's his wife and that's his brother's wife. We're not going to come to confuse the two cases. The Gemara says, really? Do we really make a gzeira when his brother is a cheresh, not to allow to divorce that wife because of when the brother, it might be a pekech? But as a Gitin Daf is what's not. We learn the Mishnah Masechta Yevamos that says, Shnei achin chadashim. If you have two brothers that are deaf mutes, now, as Rashi points out, just to understand the case of the Mishnah, since both brothers are deaf mute, we don't care about the wives if they're not deaf mutes or if they are, because it doesn't make a difference. Either way, both of their marriages are going to be with remiza, with gestures, because both brothers, who are the ones getting engaged, are deaf mutes. So therefore, the Mishnah says either way, nesuin shtei achayos pikchas, when they get married to two sisters that are totally intact, or shtei achayos charashes, or the sisters are deaf mutes, or shtei achayos, or if there's two sisters, achas pikachas, achas, one is a deaf mute, one is not, doesn't make a difference, because again, the two brothers are deaf mutes, and the same thing would be the other way too. If you have two sisters that are deaf mutes, so we don't care about the mental capacities of the husbands, because anyways the women are deaf mutes, and they're anyways only going to be able to allow to get married where they're going to do sign language. The husbands, even if they could speak, they can do sign language. Would you want to marry me? So it doesn't make a difference if when they're married to two brothers that are totally competent, or the two brothers are deaf mutes, or the two brothers, one is deaf mute and one's not. It doesn't make a difference. Anyways, they're both doing sign language to marry these women, because the women can't speak and can't hear. So these two cases, essentially, when the brothers are deaf mutes or when the sisters who are getting married are deaf mutes, they can make part of mechalitza and yibum. Why? Because both marriages are equivalent in the rabbinic marriage of a cheresh. Again, whether because the men were cheresh or the sisters, the wives were cheresh. Either way, it's only a rabbinic marriage, but they're both the same rabbinic marriage of cheresh, and now those are sister-in-law. They're sisters. So obviously, you can't marry your wife's. You have the problem about the achais isha. Your wife's sister cannot be married, and every erev is part of chalitza. So since they're the equivalent in rabbinic marriage, so okay, that's the case of that Mishnah Masechtas Yevamos. But then the Mishnah continues, says, let's say these were not sisters; they were unrelated women, and one of them dies. So there's no patur of erva. The second one cannot do chalitza. Why? Either because, like the case we said, he's a cheresh, or because the woman is a chereshes. Either way, so if he's a cheresh, he can't say, I don't want to take her. And if she's a chereshes, she can't say, Ma'in Yavami, my brother-in-law doesn't want to do yibum. So both of them have to be speaking. So again, whether it's because they're cheresh or the women are cheresh, either way, you don't have the exemption anymore of a chais isha. So the halacha is yikansu, they have to do yibum, because you can't do chalitza. If subsequently he wants to divorce her, he could divorce her. Why? Because the get of the cheresh could remove the zika of the kedushin of his brother, who was a cheresh. So obviously you see where this yavam is falling to him from a brother that's a cheresh. He could release her, and when not geyser, when his brother is going to be pekech, where then his gestures would not be effective. Sigma says you're right. It's clear. Must be because the shon mekar must be like the first answer we gave. That this case that we're saying a cheresh mekar is not going to work, because we explained in the case of yibum, must be when the brother is a pekech, where then it's not going to help the gestures of the cheresh meikarai for his brother that was a pekech for yibum, because that's where it's not going to work. But when not geyser by achav cheresh, like we see from this Mishnah Masechtas Yevamos, then we would allow you to go ahead and divorce, and it's only by the achav pekech that we say that the cheresh meikari cannot do it. But again, Rav Kana Rav's halacha will still stand. If he wasn't the cheresh meikari, he only subsequently became a cheresh, then even though now he is a cheresh, he could go ahead and divorce through his writing. Now, however, Amar Yechanan says, so again, we supported Rav Kana Rav's teaching. We said, we have a stira on him. We said, Tanoi, it's a machlekes Tanoi. The Chachamim, they say not like that. But Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, we brought a brayso that says yes. Now, Rabbi Yechanan says, Chalukah love chaver of Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, that the colleagues of Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg disagree with him, meaning that even where if he was a bekech at one point and subsequently became a cheresh, no, not like Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, not like Rav, who was going to Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, he cannot divorce even if he knows how to write. In other words, so what's Rabbi Yechanan coming to teach me? Don't say Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg was just explaining the teaching of the Tanna Kama, and he was qualifying. He says when the Tanna Kama said that a cheresh cannot go ahead and write is only cheresh meikarai, but if he was pekech then his cheresh and he would be allowed to. No, Rabbi Yechanan had a messiah that the Chacham disagree with him. And the Mabai says, he says, actually, I could show you Mishnah Masechtas Yevamos that says like what Rabbi Yechanan is saying. Because the Mishnah says that nishtatis, if the woman became mentally deranged, from after she got married. So lo yotzi, is forbidden for him to divorce her. Now, Rashi says, we know that halacha is if a woman was a bekachas and she became a deaf mute, he's allowed to divorce her because a woman, we don't need her consent. We could divorce her l'rtzaina v'shalei l'rtzaina. So if she goes mentally deranged and the husband's like, I can't stay married to this woman, he wants to divorce her, why can't I divorce her? Yeah, when she becomes mentally deranged, the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to divorce her because since she does not know how to protect herself, people are going to treat her in a very disregarding type of a way and immoral with her because she has no way of protecting herself, and that's how the Gemara explains later on. So therefore, you're not allowed to divorce her. Okay. What happens if he becomes deaf mute or he becomes mentally deranged? Says the Mishnah, he's not allowed to divorce her forever. Now, says the Gemara, Maya Lamas. What does it mean forever? Lav Avagav, isn't it coming to allude to say that even though even though he'll be able to write, he'll be able to speak from his writing and say divorce her, that the Mishnah there with the word Lamas is coming to say, no, this is done. Which is like Rabbi Yechanan who says that the Chacham disagree with Shem Glil, and even though he was a Pekeach, but since it's Nischadish right now, he's done. So seemingly it's like Rabbi Yechanan that the Chacham are coming to say, not like Shem Glil. Then Rav Papa says, not necessarily the case. If we didn't have Rabbi Yechanan's teaching, I would have said, no, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is Lafrushi Tam the Tanakama Hudasa, he's just coming to explain the Tanakama. No one disagrees with him. Everyone agrees that if you were a Pekech and an Eschadish, you could still speak from your writing. So Maya Lamas, so what is the word Lamas? It seems to be a pretty strong word. It's coming to tell us a different Chiddush. It's coming to say that Avagav the Chazina le Dechadav, even though we see that the person is still sharp-witted, it doesn't make a difference. If you're a cheresh or you became a shaita, you're done, you cannot divorce. But if you could speak from your writing, I could say maybe that was not excluded, and maybe the Tanakam would even be like Rav Shimon Gamliel, that you could still divorce through your writing. Or another approach you could say is that this that it says, Oylamis, is coming to teach a different halacha. Look at the Rabbi Yitzchak, that's what it's coming to teach. Meaning it's coming to teach from the diuk. Meaning, from the fact that the Sefer said the word Olamis and the Reisha did not say the word Olamis, is because the Reisha is coming to tell me is only rabbinic halacha like Rabbi Yitzchak. And the Sefer, which is a biblical halacha, that by the one who's doing the gerushin, the husband, we need his das, because the husband could only remove with his ratzain. So the first case was talking about when the woman goes mentally deranged. Oh, that's only rabbinic. The Sefer is talking about biblical halacha, that's why I said the word Olamis. Because Amr Bitzchi said, according to biblical halacha, a mentally deranged woman could be divorced. It's just like a regular fully sane woman that can be divorced by karcha against her will. She can be divorced even though without her consent. Why they say she cannot be divorced is simply people should not treat her in the ownerless type of a way because she has no husband protecting her. Oh, that's why I said the word Elamis. And the Sefer to say that this is different. This is a biblical halacha when the husband goes deranged, when he becomes deaf mute, and therefore cannot divorce. But it not necessarily would be excluding the halacha of Shimon Gamliel. Maybe the Chacham would agree to him that you could be medaber metech sab, you could still divorce through the writing. But again, Rabbi Yechanan has a Messiah that he says no, the Chacham do disagree with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, but it would not be a raya from that Mishnah Masechtas Yavamis. Now, continue halacha the next Mishnah. Again, continuing the theme of the previous Mishnah regarding making a shliach to write the get. So Amrullah, if they said to this healthy person, or even a dying person, but a person that it's intelligent, they tell him, Nichtav get le'ishtecha, shall we write a get to your wife that because you don't have children, and if you're going to die, she's going to have to go through the whole yibum process with your brother. V'amalahan, he says to them, Kisayvu, yeah, write it. Now, they go ahead, an Amrullah Sefer, they tell the scribe, B'kasav, and the scribe writes it. Uleidim, they tell the witnesses, v'chasm, and the witnesses sign on it. Says the Mishnah, even if they write it, and they sign it, and they give it to her, and then he goes and he gives it to her, get batal. The get is void. Why? Because because what happened was that he said to them, yeah, write it. That doesn't work. The husband has to tell the sefer to the scribe, Kesayv, to write. And to the witnesses, he has to say Chasayim to sign. He cannot tell some third party, oh yeah, tell them to write and tell them to sign. That's not going to work. So the Gemara makes a dik. It's a little bit terse to read, but time of the reason is the Amr Tenu. So Rashi explains what the Gemara is trying to say. In the Mishnah, he said, Kesayvu, write it. He didn't say, give it, but not because of what you might think. Meaning, he didn't tell them to give without writing. What does that mean? Since he said the word kisoivu, write it, he was particular, meaning that they should not be telling someone else to go ahead and write it. He said, yes, kisoivu, write it. And they went and told the scribe to write it. No, that's embarrassing for him that the word should get out that he doesn't know how to write a get. And therefore, even Reb Meir would agree that if he said, write this get for my wife, even if he tells it to a bezin, which we had this on the previous daf, that this discussion on Daf Samach Vav Mabez, Reb Meir said, oh yeah, they could tell other people to do it. No, he did not make them a court to permit others to do this. He says, I want you guys to write. I don't want the word to get out. I don't know how to write. So it says the Gemara, it sounds like the reason is because he didn't just say give. He said, oh, so write. So he's makpid about that. I want you guys to write and not to hand this off to someone else. But it sounds like ha'amar tenu. If he didn't say write, he just says, give this get to my wife. Ooh, that would sound like that noisnin. That then you would be able to give it to the woman. Meaning they could tell others to write it and they could give it because he made them into a court. Now, as Rashi points out, obviously we're talking about where there was 3 people that he said it to, because there was to 2 people. Even Rameh would agree that even if he doesn't say write and he just says give, they would have to write it themselves, because that's what the Mishnah teaches in Samach Vav Mabez. Even the Rashi says lakaman. Now, Gersa, it was earlier that if he says to 2 people, give a get to my wife, or 3 people, and he says write and give the get to my wife, that everyone agrees you have to write it themselves and then give it. But if he says to 3 people to new, then they could tell others and they could write and they could give it because he made them into a bezin according to Reb Meir. BC disagrees. And he says, no, even by 3 people, even if he doesn't say write it, they themselves have to write it. But that's the same thing that we're saying over here, that the Mishnah that's saying that he says to them, kisvu, write it, sounds like that if he didn't say write it, so then this get would not be possible. So it must be talking about, for example, if there were 3 people, and says the Gemara, Mani, so who's our Mishnah like? Reb Meir he. It must be going like Reb Meir. The Amar that he says, Mili Mimsrin L'Shlich, that words could be given over to an agent, meaning it's normal to make an agent even with words. And then, with words, you'll still say, Shluch Shalom Kamaisai. So therefore, when there were 3 people, where you could say that he made them into a court to tell others, so they could tell the scribe to write it and witnesses to sign it. That's what it sounds like from the opening words of our Mishnah. The problem is, Ema Seifa. Look a little bit later in the Mishnah. Mishnah says, okay, that this is not going to work, because in the case of our Mishnah was, he said to write it, and they didn't write it themselves, they gave it over to someone else. The Mishnah says, until he, the husband, tells the scribe to write it. And he says to the witnesses to sign it. Now that sounds like that there's no way of permitting to tell others to write. It's just you have to hear directly from the mouth of the husband that says to write it. And even 3 people, even if he doesn't say write it, because why are you saying until he tells them? What do you mean until he tells them? You don't have to tell them. Just say it in different words, and then they'll be able to hand it off. So that's Ason Rabbi Yasi. That actually sounds like Rabbi Yasi, the Amar that he says, Mili Loimim Srin L'Shlich. The words cannot be given up because you're saying, oh, but until this is the only way. Only way? That's all. That's what Rabbi Yasi says. You cannot. There's no ways of giving over words. So it comes out Reisha Meir b'Sefer Rabbi Yasi. It comes out the Reisha of the Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir, who sounds like from the dig we're saying is because he said Kesoivu, but if he didn't say Kesoivu, it said Tenu, that would sound like that. Then they would be able to hand it over to someone else. But then the Sefer that says until you say like this sounds like Rabbi Yasi. It says no, there's no way of handing it over. They have to hear. He has to say directly to them because words cannot be given over. The Gemara says, yes, you're right. Reisha Meir b'Sefer Rabbi Yasi. The Tana of our Mishnah is actually 2 different Tanoim. The first half is Rabbi Meir, that actually you would be able to give over words just not by Kesevu. And the Sefer is like Rabbi Yasi, even though it sounds like it's one flow of one Mishnah. Abaya wants to say no. It's very difficult to say it's 2 different Tanoim. He says, no, Kul Reb Meir, it's all like Reb Meir. How's that possible? Because what are we talking about over here? This Sefer that says, until he says to the scribe himself, which again, according to Reb Meir, you don't have to tell the scribe yourself. There's ways of saying it. Yeah. Because the lawyer Tenu. Because the Sefer is talking about where he did not say give without saying write. So essentially, the way Rashi makes it sound like the way he has to read the Mishnah is that if someone says to write it, and that's what really the Reish was talking about, it's not going to be kosher only if you say to the scribe himself. But you're right, of course, if you said Tenu, that would also work, but the Sefer is qualifying the Reisha. Say, if you're going to say Kesaibu, it's only going to be kosher if you say to the scribe himself. So the Gemara says, wait a second. If that's the case, since you're exceeding this idea that it's saying it's like Remeir, and there is a permitted way for people to tell others to do it. So then the Mishnah shouldn't have said what you're saying. It should have said it's not a get until you say to give it without saying the word to write it. And then for sure, obviously, you would know if you tell it to the scribe himself. So rather obviously that we picked specifically in the Seifa that no, it sounds like even if you would say Tnu, it wouldn't work. So that's not like your mayor. So that's not like the way Abai is trying to answer. So Ella Hachmai Skin rather says, you know what we're talking about over here in the Sefer? Is Deloyam Beit Lasa, where he didn't tell it to 3 people. By 2 people, Remeir agrees that even if you say Tnu, as we proved, he must be talking about in all cases, they themselves have to write it because he didn't make them into a court. The Gemara still doesn't like that. If that's the case, so then should have said until he tells the 3 people, and then they could tell other people to write it. But why are you saying until he tells it to them directly? So rather, the Gemara wants to say, okay, a different answer. Not the whole thing is Remeir, rather Kul Rabbi Yitzi. The whole Mishnah is Rabbi Yitzi. What are we talking about over here? I mean, in other words, now we have to be miyash of the Reisha. Or the Reisha is the difficult part. Because Rabbi Yitzi holds that, not like Remeir, that words cannot be given over, but we said the Reisha sounded like the dik we made. That's only because he said Kesevu. But if you didn't say Kesevu, then it would sound like if you said Tnu that you would be able to hand over the words. It's not true. Rabbi Yitzi doesn't hold that you can give over the words. So on that, the Gemara wants to answer that the reason why the Reisha said that he told them write it was not to be medayik that if he would have said Tnu without Kesevu, then they would be able to tell others and they'd be able to write it. No. The reason why it's possible is because because he didn't tell them to tell us over to other people. In other words, the dig you should make is that the reason is because he didn't tell them to tell this over. But if he would tell it to 2 people, tell it to that person and he should write it, and to that and that person they should sign on it, and they said to that scribe and he wrote into those Edom and he signed it, that would work. Because Rabbi Yisrael would agree in such a case because he made them a shlich to do this. Here he told them, shrab, he told them write. That if I told you, you can't give over those words to other people. But if I told you to tell other people, what's called Aymer Amru, oh, that would work. And that's the dig the Mishnah is coming to tell us. Yeah, the dig is there. But not to say because if you said Tnu would work. No, the dig is to say, yeah, I told you to write. But had I told you to tell someone else to write, oh, then Rabbi Yisrael would agree that would work. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, so then you have the same question you had on your mayor, now you have the same thing on Rabbi Yisrael. So why is the Sefer the Mishnah then saying, okay, this is not going to work. This is not going until he tells them directly. It's not true. It should have said, until he tells them to tell. Then it's going to work. Moreover, is that really so? Like you're trying to say that Rabbi Yisrael agrees in the case of Ayma Amru when he tells him to tell that does work? It's not true. But now we learn the Mishnah and that Peizayin Mabez later on tells us that Kesab Sefer ve'ed kosher. If you have on the document 1 kosher witness and you have the writing of the scribe. Now, he qualifies that. He says, don't say that the get is going to be kosher with the signature of 1 witness together with just the handwriting of the scribe. Rather, what the Mishnah means to say is, chasam sefer sheninu. We mean to say that besides the 1 witness that's on it, you also have the scribe who signed on the get, not just wrote the get, also signed on it. That's what the Mishnah says is going to be kosher. And we already had this Gemara already previously on the Daf Samach Vav Mabez. V'amar Rav Chizda, he says, Masnitin, the Mishnah that validates the signing of this cipher on the get with this 1 other aid, says Rav Chizda, Mani, you know who that is? That's Gitin Daf Avayin Beizim and Aleph. That must be Rabbi Yossi. And therefore, there's no concern of any possible problems that might arise from this halacha. Because the Amar he holds, words cannot be given over to an agent. Because according to a mayor, there's a big concern. What's the concern? Sometimes what might happen is that he's going to tell 2 people that tell that guy to write and tell those 2 other people to sign. Now, these 2 agents are going, and they're concerned it's embarrassing to the sefer that why am I not one of the witnesses? So they're going to tell him, yeah, you'll be one of these witnesses. And that's not with the consent of the husband. But according to Rabbi Yossi, there's no such concern because you're never going to have anyone doing their jobs only if they're directly from the husband. There's no concern about the shluchim being embarrassed and telling him something that the husband didn't really say. The problem is, if you're going to think to say, then Rabbi Yossi agrees that you could give over words. When the husband said to say it over, So nafik minei churba, then it could be destructive over here. That this same problem would be even according to Rabbi Yossi. Because the zim namlu l'shnayim, at times it could happen that the husband will tell to two people. Okay, tell that scribe, Shimon the scribe to write. Well, the plain yichtim and tell Laban Yehuda to sign. But because of the shame of the scribe, so they're going to be concerned. They don't want to tell him that you're not the witness. They're going to have him sign. The husband didn't say that, and you tell me according to Rabbi Yossi that he agrees. So the Gemara says you're right because of the two questions we asked. Rather, it's clear that Reisha and Meir b'sev Rabbi Yossi. That the truth is that the Reisha of the Mishnah must be like Rameir, and the Sefer Rabbi Yossi because we fell off. We couldn't say it's all Rameir. We couldn't say it's all Rabbi Yossi, as we had two questions. First of all, even when there's a according to Rabbi Yossi, it should have said Achiyem Amru Mebayale, and also then he doesn't even know all the Amru works. So how could you tell me that he could be the Tana of the Reisha that's saying that the problem is because he said Kaseibu, which the diak is that if he didn't say you should write, but rather he said that you should tell others to write, that then it would work. It's not true. Amru wouldn't work. So therefore, we have to go back to say you're right. The Reish is Rameh is Sefer Rabbi Yossi. Or Rav Ashi says no. Kol Rabbi Yossi. I could tell you the whole Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi. Now we're back to the question. Why did the Reish say that the reason why it was possible because he told him to write it, which the dig seems to be that something else would be kosher, which we said, well, what would that be? Even according to Rabbi Yossi, even Amru wouldn't work. So that's lav dafka. And the truth is that even if he said not right, but even if he said give it would also be possible, as the Sefer the Mishnah teaches, because he himself has to tell the scribe directly and to write. This that it used the word of kisayvu was just the normal way of the Tana to speak and to talk about the case, to say, I don't have to tell you this, but even this would be possible, as the Gemara says. And he was telling me what's unnecessary. I don't have to tell you where he didn't say give it, where he said just write it, that's not going to work. So even though it seems to be like ikr chasr, like it doesn't say it, but that's like what he's explaining the Mishnah was saying. And he said write it. For sure that's not going to work. Because even if he said to give it, it wouldn't work. Because again, it's all Rabbi Yossi. So I don't have to tell you. So he didn't tell to three people that for sure is not going to work. Even the Mayor holds doesn't work when it's less than three. I know this is Rabbi Yossi. That even if he had said it to three people, it wouldn't work. And I don't have to say where he didn't say to tell others to say, for sure it's not going to work. Because even if he says to say it's not going to work, because that's really where the Sefer ends. I mean, the Reish is starting off on the lowest point and saying, okay, buddy, if he said to write it, this is not going to work. And you know what? It's not even necessary for me to say that, because the truth is, even if he said to know, it wouldn't work. And even if he said it to, even two, for sure not, but even three wouldn't work. Until the Sefer of the Mishnah says, and what's going to work? What's going to work is you tell them directly, because none of these cases are going to work. So therefore, that's the Rav Ashi's way of resolving and saying that it's all like Rabbi Yossi. And says the Gemara Tani Kappa said to Rav Ashi, we really have a brayso that says like Rav Ashi, that yes, Rabbi Yossi holds it's not valid even by Oima Amru when you tell him to tell. Because the brayso says, Kasav Sefer Lishma, if the scribe writes the get for the sake of this woman, V'chasma Eden Lishma, and the witnesses sign it for her name. Even though they write it and they sign it and they give it to him, to the husband. And then he gives it to her. How do you get bottled? The get's going to be bottled. Why? Because until they hear his voice, because although they did a very good job, and he's like, yeah, great, I'm happy you gave me this delivered get. No, they have to hear his voice, that he tells to the scribe to write it, and he tells the witnesses to sign it, which the Gemara shows there's two ideas over here. Yishmu, this that they have to hear him telling the scribe, that's lafukim manda amamayder b'yisi ba'imam. That's coming to exclude from the one who says Rabbi Yossi agrees when he tells them to tell someone else. No, they have to hear from him directly telling to the scribe. And this that used the word kaila, his voice, is lafukim and comes to exclude from the opening teaching of today's daf. He said on daf ayin alf that a cheresh that could speak from his writing is going to be valid, but there's no words coming out of his mouth. He holds you could write and give the get to his wife. These two words of sheyishma kailai, sheyishma is that it has to be directly, and kailai is to say excluding from Kan Merav that says that you could speak from your writing, and that was saying that no, it has to be his actual voice, and that's what these two teachings are. Therefore, you say like this halacha of Rav Ashi. Thank you to Anytime for hosting us.